flown in. Harvard A. In closing government, we have Monash C. And in closing opposition, we have Vermont A. Did I get that right? The standing orders are the same as throughout the tournament, and you're so good, you debaters, that your timekeeper is Fiona Crowns. That was really nice. I don't know how you interpreted it. Ladies and gentlemen, the motion is that this House believes South American countries should nationalise their natural resources, and I would like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the case for the government.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, the motion has already been introduced, and the government would like to get stuck right in. The model that we're proposing is a very simple and cogent one. We firstly would like to recognize that the history of South American countries, particularly in the context of their economic development and their current reliance on their resource-rich nature, necessitates that we give back some of what we have taken from them in the past, and we give it back to them in a standardized, fair manner that allows both the companies that have invested a great deal of money into taking oil out of countries like Venezuela their right to get something back, and the people in South America their overwhelming right to prosper from the rich national resources of their land. So the model that we're proposing from the opening half of the government is that we shall not pay these companies for their repurchasing rights, but we will pay them fair market value for the investment in infrastructure that they have made into oil fields, distribution facilities, ports, and so on and so forth. We think this is a very simple model, and I will be answering three fundamental questions. First of all, I'm going to be answering why is this proposal needed. Secondly, I'm going to be telling you why it is not just needed, it's justified. And thirdly, I'll give you an enunciation of how this is going to work. My second speaker, Mitch, is going to discuss why taxation, which is possibly some of the alternative that the opposition might come up with, might not work, and he will also tell you why foreign direct investment will flourish under our model. And let me get on to my first point without further ado. So why is this needed, ladies and gentlemen? Well, we would say that South America has often found itself an underdeveloped economy. If we look at the political and economic conflicts that have taken place in countries like Venezuela, we see that countries like the United States have often agitated for governments to be put in power, governments of dictators that allow foreign oil companies like Shell, like ExxonMobil, to go into Venezuela, negotiate cut-price contracts to steal oil, more or less, from the people who are not represented by these governments, and therefore are ripping these people off. We say that when you have an underdeveloped economy that is very, very prone to both corruption and autocratic government, we think that something needs to be done. And we see now that Venezuela does not have an autocratic government, although, that may be a contention that comes out from this side. We see the president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, enjoying an unparalleled popularity, but at the same time having the sort of checks and balances within his own population that give a good and prosperous democratic future to Venezuela. We also see that a country like Venezuela spends a lot of money on subsidizing the cost of fuel, on subsidizing the cost of food, and the basic necessities of living for its own people. So we would say that a country that is only reliant on tax revenues for its further development is severely crippled in this fashion. What we would argue is that the imperative for the government to reap the benefits of their own oil, instead of companies like Petronas in Malaysia, no offense guys, like Shell from wherever the hell Shell are from, and from ExxonMobil, those evil greedy corporate pirates, we say that that is a major problem. We would like the government to spend more money that it can get from nationalizing its oil field and its resources into things like infrastructure, and by that we mean roads, but into things like education, and by that we mean primary schools, secondary schools, universities, and finally into wealth generation, into giving money to targeted industries that prove the future of Venezuela and other South American countries. Yes, I'll take it.
Given that even before nationalization, the multinationals in Venezuela were paying up to 70% of the cost of a barrel of oil in tax, why do you need that extra revenue? Why can't you just spend the money you've got?
That's an excellent question. The problem you see is that the companies then have the option of choosing how much oil to pump out of Venezuela. They have the option of picking the price of oil by controlling its source and demand. And that is a huge problem, because maybe Venezuela would like to sell more oil. Maybe Venezuela doesn't care whether the world price of oil is at the level that it is now. And I think everyone in this room would agree that it's overpriced. But the problem is that this control lies in the hands of companies, and we would like to wrest it out of their hands. So secondly, I'd like to talk about this issue of why is our model justified. We would say that historically underdeveloped companies have sold surveying rights, and that these countries, have been led by people who don't care whether they get the most bang for their buck. The only thing that drives dictators to sell rights to their oil fields and nationalize is how much money they are going to get. These people never considered the economic future of their country, and for that reason, there is an incredibly strong moral and economic imperative. And we also see that in a place like Venezuela, you have the population agitating for change. You have indigenous landless individuals asking for land, but the government cannot necessarily give them this land because its resource stream is limited. And the land that Venezuela has that could be used profitably by landless farmers is instead being sold also to foreign companies for profit, because a government like Venezuela, which spends a lot of its money on shoring up political parties within its own borders and outside of the country, has a lot of demand for resources and money, and most of this money, if not all of this money, is not going into the things that we would like it to go. I mentioned infrastructure, I mentioned education, I mentioned targeted investments to different kinds of industry. Yes, sir, I'll take you.
I'm very confused. Your contention is that these dictators are so rapacious that they're not putting this money where they want to, so you want to give them complete control over the entire resources of the entire country?
That's not what I'm contending. My contention is that these countries do not have dictators anymore. They have populist governments, democratically elected, the best sort of system where we can see organic change and legislative checks and balances to the power of someone like Hugo Chavez. This did not exist when these contracts were first negotiated, and it does exist now. Therefore, we see that there is a fit set for change. So the question of how it will work has already been answered in part by my other 2 points, but I would like to say it in this way. Countries have learned the lessons of Saudi Arabia and Aramco. Countries know that if you don't invest in future infrastructure, you are extremely vulnerable to the price changes and volatility of natural resources. Countries have also learned the lessons of Nigeria, that if you don't freely and equitably distribute the wealth of your nation, then militants, insurgents, and terrorists will use that to their advantage. Therefore, we would say that the way that this model will work is to rely upon the civil society, the growing, burgeoning democracy in countries like Venezuela, to act as an organic counter against the potential autocratic aspirations of someone like Hugo Chavez. For all of these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, because it is absolutely untenable that people steal other people's natural resources and rights, we are very proud to propose.
Prime Minister, and I'd like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We think that when your prime example of a flourishing democracy adequately and properly allocating natural resources is Venezuela, you've gone seriously off the mark. And we intend to show today, based on the primacy of the economic concerns, and how we don't think you can gain any extra money. We think you lose a lot of long-term capital investment and lose a lot of other very serious economic harms to a nation. And secondly, on the basis of political effects. And I think we really didn't see any kind of analysis of this today. But not only how we see this fostering corruption within nations, but how we see it affecting other sort of secondary concerns like the environment, like workers' rights. But we say there are essentially a lot of flow-on effects from this. This is the first look at this model they set up today. Because this idea they basically had was that it would be very simple, we'll just not pay for repurchasing rights, but we will pay for the investments. We say it's never that simple. And it's never that simple, first of all, because there isn't a basic agreed value to the investments that have already occurred within the nation. We say that when private acquisitions within the oil industry, or within any natural resources industry, already sometimes take years and involve huge squads of lawyers, and this is when both companies are acting in good faith. No, thank you, sir. We don't think that that's what's going to happen when we see a state actor, which clearly has disproportionate power by the very fact of its exerted intention to take over these oil fields. We think what you're actually going to see are hugely unfair deals which deprive the oil companies of their rights to their property. Even if you don't think those rights themselves are important, what we're going to be showing you in the economic analysis is how we think you lose a huge deal of other trade inflows into this country, how we think you lose a huge deal of secondary investment, and how we think you actually push up the prices on your debt, which in the current market is far more important than the sort of marginal extra amount they hope to get out of the oil itself. I think it's really important to consider the secondary effects it's going to have on your financial system.
Point, sir.
Second point we want to make here is this idea, they said this is stolen oil because these were non-representative governments in the past. Yeah. We say the first problem with this is that we don't believe it was always the case that the previous governments were any less representative than the current ones are. And we point them to their prime example of Venezuela. We say it's not entirely clear at all that Hugo Chavez is more representative of the popular will than those that preceded him. But we say that secondly, there's a clear alternative here in renegotiating certain aspects of contracts. We think contracts are often open to this. We think this is how Venezuela has pushed up the share of oil revenue it receives to somewhere on the lines of 70%. We think we're seeing oil companies increasingly open to that as they fear this kind of alternative when we look at places like Ecuador, when we look at places like Bolivia and secondary resources. No, thank you. They next had this kind of idea, they said, well, look at Venezuela. Hugo Chavez is hugely popular, therefore he's sort of our great example. We say a couple of problems there. One problem that's going to sort of flow into the economic analysis is this idea of short-term versus long-termism. But we say the second problem is that we think there's a fundamental problem with using a sort of populist who's exerted money, who's exerted sort of short-term money, but hasn't fostered any kind of investment in the economy, as your example of a popular mandate. We don't see any popular mandate in Venezuela that's been approved by a free and fair election. But this kind of brings me into the broader economic analysis here, because we think that's what's really important to recognise as a basic supposition for this debate, is that you can make money out of oil fields and out of other natural resources without nationalising. And we currently are making huge money. When we look at the percentage of tax revenues that we're often charging on these things, we say we're actually getting in a lot of money from this. What I think is really important to recognise is that when you nationalise, you don't necessarily get more profits. We point you to the initial example of Venezuela's PDVSA, the oil company. When it initially nationalised in the 1980s, we say its revenues didn't actually increase to the state any more than they had previously. We think the only way you can get more money out of it is essentially to gut the company for short-term gain. Now, we think the way you do that is you don't invest in long-term policies that are only going to net results 20 years down the line, when a company will still exist, but a strong man in power, a populist, won't still exist. We think instead what you do is you get rid of those huge exploration costs, and we say they are huge. In cases like Venezuela, it can be only one-third of oil exploration projects actually come to fruition.
On that point.
We think that in that scenario, what you do is you go for a short-term gain over a long one. I accept you, sir.
No, Lewis. What happens right now is because of the 70% tax, you see them firstly not investing in additional capital, and secondly restricting prices, restricting supply to keep prices high.
We think there are a couple of responses to that. The first one is to look at what's actually occurred, because we say that what's actually occurring in Venezuela is that PDVSA hasn't invested in any oil exploration in the last several years, and we actually see oil production rates within Venezuela plummeting. We say that the only reason we have this illusion of a short-term gain in Venezuela is the huge spike in oil prices around the world. We say that short of that, we actually haven't seen any of this kind of long-term investment. Now we say, where does a company's incentive lie? A company's incentive lies essentially in building up future capacity in a way that it simply doesn't with these short-term populists. I think that's really important to recognise. We think it's also important to recognise that you're harming in this side of the house your long-term future ability to bring these oil companies back in, even if you make a mistake. We say in the point that you cripple world markets, you undo that ability. Let's then secondly this idea of political effects. Because we think the basic sort of recognition here is that insofar as we bring in more money to the state from a non-taxation source, we become less responsive to our citizens as a nation. And we say that insofar as that occurs, we think that even if you say there will be a certain degree of corruption under either side of the house, it's important to recognise that corruption within the state actually makes the state more vulnerable to political turbulence. We think this happens for two reasons. The first reason is that it makes populists who are already in power have more of an incentive to stay in power, because they have essentially more access to corruption for their programs. We say that secondly, it makes coups more likely, because the state becomes essentially the nexus of power and wealth within the state. We say that becomes a reason for other external parties to want to take over control of the state. We say, why is this different with companies? We think the first really big thing stopping corruption with Western natural resources companies is that the countries in which they operate, in Western countries, have laws against it. And we point you to the United States, where we think the Corrupt Foreign Practices Act has a huge effect in discouraging companies from any international practices that could reflect corruption, because they can be prosecuted in US courts. So this is what we've seen happening with UBS, the Swiss financial company, whose directors currently face trial in American courts under the Corrupt Foreign Practices Act. We say this restricts corruption within these Latin American countries. We say the European Union is looking at similar conditions. We say, if you look at the opposite occasion, look what's happening with Latin American companies in power. We say that PDVSA, Venezuela's oil company, recently stopped publishing its financial accounts publicly because it doesn't want that kind of scrutiny. The final idea under this idea of corruption is that we think there are some really important other considerations to take into account. We think that workers' rights do matter when it comes to natural resources, because we think that some of these mining explorations are some of the most dangerous occupations to be in. We think that secondly, environmental considerations are very important. We recognise that a lot of these explorations are taking place in coral reefs, are taking place in virgin rainforests. We think insofar as that's important, we think that we're far more likely to get accountability from Western NGOs being able to look over Western companies than we are from these governments themselves, who have absolutely no record of protecting these natural resources without foreign pressure forcing them to do so. We think on that basis it's really important to have this accountability as well. So on these grounds, a simple sort of economic gain from doing so, on creating more political accountability and reducing the corruption and reducing the susceptibility of the state to coups, this side of the House is proud to oppose.
I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Here he is.
Mr. Speaker, Lewis just got up here and he admitted to us that we've seen a dramatic decrease in the amount of oil being taken out of the ground in Venezuela. He admitted to us that we've seen a dramatic lack of capital investment in Venezuela. And we'd say that the exact reason for that is because we're taxing the hell out of these companies that were existing there, because the government hasn't been able to receive the full benefit of oil. We say that when Latin American countries receive dollar for dollar the benefit of the oil that they get out of the ground, that's when they're going to invest in more efficient means, that's when they're going to dig out more oil from the ground that's going to better serve their people, that they're going to be able to sell at a high price on the world markets. I'm going to talk about three things in this debate, and I'm going to mesh my rebuttal and my substantive together. The first thing I'm going to talk about is why can't we have a tax, and why is regulation a bad idea, and can we renegotiate contracts, which is something that Lewis flagged but never really told us how we can renegotiate these things. The second thing I want to talk about is foreign direct investment now and into the future. The third thing I want to talk about is Lewis's scattergun, corruption and environment and all that stuff he wanted to do in the last 30 seconds of his speech. Let's talk about this first thing of why can't we use a tax, why doesn't it work, and can we renegotiate? Well, we've seen taxes in place already. We've already heard from side opposition that these taxes are exceptionally oppressive. When you have 70% of your profits being taken and given to the government, there's absolutely no incentive for any company to dig more oil out the ground. So what happens currently? We say two things happen. Firstly, companies don't invest in capital. They don't improve the efficiency of their mechanisms because they want to keep their profits as high as possible. The second thing that they do is that they restrict the supply to keep prices as high as possible and maximise profits in the short run. That's exactly the situation we've seen in Ecuador. It's exactly the situation we've seen in Bolivia and Venezuela. So then, what about if we regulate these things? Well, firstly, we can't regulate the companies upgrade their capital. We think that that's almost impossible to do. We don't think that's controversial. Secondly, you can absolutely regulate supply and say, hey, go and dig more stuff out of the ground. But we think that companies do three things in response to that. The first thing is that they drag their feet. They say, oh, we don't have the manpower, or we don't have the capacity right now to do it. The second thing that they do is they don't explore more, which is exactly what's happened in Latin America already, where they say, oh, we don't have the profits to go out and explore for more natural resources so that they can actually artificially decrease supply. The third thing they do is they lie to governments. And we think that governments just don't have the checks and balances there to go out and figure out whether these oil companies are lying to them. So we think that those are three ways, no thank you, that governments, that private oil companies can get around this. That's why in the Middle East we see that all these companies, all the oil is owned by governments, because the fact of the matter is that the only people who can actually pump this stuff out of the ground, do it efficiently, are governments. Let's move on to this second idea, which is foreign direct investment now and into the future. Firstly, as Nihal told you, Most of these contracts were made via exploitation in two ways. Firstly, because the governments didn't know how much oil they had at the time, when Shell and ExxonMobil did. And secondly, because there were dictators in power in the 60s and 70s when these deals were made. And when you're a dictator and someone offers you $1 billion, you just don't care, because $1 billion in your pocket is pretty good. $5 billion doesn't make a whole bit of a difference to you. Secondly, we'd say that these companies like Shell and ExxonMobil are still very much involved in these countries after nationalisation. We say that governments don't have the capacity to get this out of the grounds by themselves. They get these companies to come back as consultants. We say that these companies still own the petrol stations. They still often own the transportation systems. We think that they make a lot of money from that. What does that mean? It means that they've still got a massive incentive to make sure that there are functioning ports so they can ship it overseas if Shell is in charge of the shipment. We think that there's a massive incentive to have good roads so that you can ship the oil as quickly as possible. Lewis.
So, the IMF fundamentally disagrees with the nature of nationalising these. With nations currently seeking new debt in the crisis, why is this a good idea?
Well, firstly, we'd say the oil prices are at a low, so if you want to talk about minimising debt, now is the time that we can actually do that. Secondly, we'd say the fact that you've already acknowledged that we're seeing decreases in supply in these countries and we're seeing no capital investment is a really good reason why governments can step in to actually stimulate these things right now. The third thing I want to talk about with foreign direct investment is it doesn't affect other sectors in the economy. Oil is one part of these economies. So we're not talking about a nationalisation of every single resource here, so let's not get too doomsday about it. The fourth thing is that we've seen massive public-private partnerships in many other sectors of the economy where we're still going to see investment. We've seen it with investment banks, we've seen it with mass transportation in Mexico being public-private partnerships through companies like Macquarie Bank. We've seen it in India with sewage. And the way that they regulate it, no thank you, is they give these companies a partial share of profit or they give them a partial ownership. So we'd say that when we're talking about non-scarce natural resources, we'd say that that's when you don't nationalise something, that's when you let foreigners come in. We'd say that when these economies are so driven towards oil and natural gas and other resources, for the benefit of those people in the countries and not for the benefit of the rich Malaysians and the rich Dutch, we should make sure that we nationalise these. The final thing I want to talk about is Lewis's scattergun at the end. And the first thing that he talked about was corruption in the state. And he said that corporations are less likely to be exposed, no thank you, to corruption. We'd say, well, we think that corruption exists right now when you have a 70% tax. We'd say the incentive for governments to be corrupt is going to be there under either model. We don't think that like the difference between taking 70 cents in the dollar and getting $1 for the dollar is going to make all that much of a difference to corruption. But secondly, we'd say that these countries are improving their democratic records. We think that people are becoming more scrupulous about what's happening in these countries. So we think that corruption is definitely decreasing. Lewis.
So won't this reverse this trend insofar as it puts more money in the hands of the state, which doesn't come from tax revenues and is hence not accountable?
Well, I don't know what this trend that you're talking about is, but no, when you're talking about 70 cents in the dollar versus $1, we just don't think that there's a massive difference. If the corruption exists at 70 cents in the dollar, we think it's going to exist at $1. We think that governments can put that 70 cents in the dollar in their pocket right now. They can put the $1 in their pocket right now. That's not a particularly good argument unless you want to reduce all taxes so that the government can't ever commit corruption. We'd say that when we look at these Latin American countries, we've seen a lot of money flowing through to the people. We'd say that sometimes it's been used for subsidies, which we don't think is a massively good idea, but we think that in general it's being used for education and roads. We think that more of it can be used for education and roads. The last thing that Lewis wanted to talk about was the environment. We'd say that nobody can actually regulate the environment better than a government, right? And we think that the government is much better to regulate the environment than the private sector to regulate the environment. We say the private sector, when it's the oil industry, one of the biggest polluting industries in the world, is never going to regulate itself. We say that when the government controls oil and it controls the environment at the same time, it can strike a happy balance. So we think that nationalisation actually falls in favour on that point. So, Mr. Speaker, because it's impossible to tax effectively, because we can't make these people dig it out of the ground and invest in capital infrastructure, because we don't think that foreign direct investment is going to fall over, and because we think that corruption exists under either model, we're very proud to propose.
I now call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we had this bizarre assertion from the last speaker that this is only going to affect oil and the rest of the economy will be fine and will continue on entirely unaffected. We think that is an absolute joke. So the first point I'm going to talk about is the geopolitical and broader economic implications of this and what this is going to do to the rest of these countries' economies. And then I'm going to look at economics and politics again and explain why they've misunderstood those. So the first thing we say is that when countries do this, they are essentially hitching their wagon to a failing Bolivarian revolution. They are essentially hitching their wagon to the Hugo Chavez brand, and that isn't working out too well for those that have joined them. We tell you that this has much broader implications for their relationships with the rich world, for their relationships with the developed world, for their relationships which are ultimately going to be crucial to them actually developing sustainably and becoming rich themselves. What we tell you is that especially in the current financial crisis, when many of these governments are in fact on the verge of bankruptcy, that they need the goodwill of the rich world, they need the goodwill of the IMF, and they need the goodwill of the World Bank. When you steal lots of American property, and we don't care whether this is American imperialism or not, we live in the real world. When you steal a lot of American property, America's not going to like you anymore. What that does is it makes it much, much more difficult, no thank you, for these countries to get the kind of help that they're going to need in the current crisis. They talked about how land reform is crucial. Well, if they want to do land reform without just stealing people's land, if they want to compensate them like they claim they're going to compensate for this oil, they're going to need to buy debt on the world market. That debt becomes much, much more expensive when you annoy, no thank you, everyone who's selling that debt to you. But what we tell you more importantly, though, is that real prosperity simply doesn't come in these kind of countries from seizing natural resources. We tell you that Africa is the most natural resource-rich part of the world, and it's also the poorest. That's not necessarily a coincidence. What we tell you is that countries that rely on oil for development have a spectacularly poor record of actually achieving free market democracies and free market liberalism, which is the kind of thing that has actually worked, no thank you, for the rest of the world to develop. What we think these countries need to do is emulate countries, no thank you, like China and India that have had export-led growth. And the way to do that is to have free trade agreements with these rich countries whose property you're seizing. So we think that's quite problematic, no thank you. But what they told you is that this isn't going to affect the broader economy at all. Only if you believe that big oil has no political power, we think that's quite unlikely. Only if you believe that hitching yourself to Hugo Chavez is going to endear yourself to the rich world. It's simply not true. What we tell you is that once you steal property belonging to any Western companies, that makes all Western companies, and by extension most Western governments, quite unlikely to want to help you and quite unlikely to want to invest in your economy. Sir?
We're not stealing from them, we're going to pay free market value, but the point
is...
No,
you're not, because there's no free market when you're seizing their property. That's the definition of an unfree market. It's not a voluntary sale, so we can't actually achieve real market prices. So let's move on to this idea of economics. And what we essentially told you is that tax is working to provide solid revenue streams for these countries. But they told us two things in response to this. First of all, that there's no capital investment from Western oil companies, as if the profit that they get to keep means nothing to them, as if they don't actually care about long-term profit streams and their viability. No, thank you. We tell you that's entirely untrue. That in fact Western companies are quite keen to invest in capital and exploration in a sustainable and manageable way. No, thank you. But what they also tell you is that these companies just want to pump less oil. We tell you this is absurd. They only want to pump less oil at the point at which that will drive up the price of oil, which will also drive up the tax revenue that these countries are receiving from their oil. So we in fact say that the incentives are aligned.
Point of information.
No, thank you. So we tell you that that's the real problem. And they talked about how 70 cents on a dollar and $1 on a dollar doesn't really make that much difference. But they ignored the meat of Lewis's analysis, which is not just that companies are going to seize that extra 30 cents on the dollar. In fact, they're going to seize like an extra $1.50 on the dollar. Because instead of investing in the long-term development of their countries, they're subject to populist pressures which force them to be short-termists, which force them to spend all of the money that they would otherwise spend on, for example, exploration, on things like giving free money to the poor. That's what Hugo Chavez has done. That's why his country is in so much trouble. It's been lovely for the 10 years or so while it lasted, while we had a massive oil price spike, and now he's in the doghouse. No, thank you. We tell you that there has been no exploration in Venezuela for the last 5 years or so, and we tell you that as a result, oil profits and oil yields and the amount of oil they've been able to get out of the ground has just plummeted. It's been a disaster for them. And what they told us in answer to this is that, well, the Western companies haven't invested. They seem to have forgotten that Chavez was in charge of the country for the last 8 years, so lack of investment in oil has been his decision, not the Western companies' decisions. Finally, let's look at this idea of political effects. No, thank you. What we tell you, first of all, is that when companies seize revenue streams that are entirely unrelated to their citizens, entirely unrelated to being responsive to those citizens, they tend to become less responsive to their citizens. The more of this revenue they have, the less responsive we think they'll be. No, thank you. They didn't really challenge that. No, thank you. What they did challenge was this idea of corruption. They tell us, well, they're going to be corrupt with their 70 cents on the barrel, but they'll be no less corrupt with their $1 on the barrel. Well, first of all, an extra 30 cents of corruption per dollar is almost 50% more corruption. That's quite bad. No, thank you. But more importantly, we tell you that governments have incentives for corruption that simply do not exist with regard to private companies. Why is that? Because private companies, if they're incorporated in America or Europe, all of their operations globally are subject to things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, so their directors can go to jail if they're corrupt. So we think governments simply don't have that pressure. We say it's the same thing with regard to workers' rights and environmental rights. We agree with them that generally governments are better at regulating this than private industry. But that's because government isn't in that private industry and they don't have the profit motive of making as much money as they possibly can from oil. We tell you in this case, they're not going to particularly care about workers' rights or about environmental concerns because they want all the money they can possibly get to shore up their incredibly corrupt populist governments. That's the way the incentives work here. What we tell you, in fact, with regard to Western companies, though, is that they are subject to political pressures at home. They are subject to public opinion pressures at home and around the world, which simply don't apply to governments like that of Venezuela. We tell you that all of the incentives here are for short-termism, are for corruption, are for ignoring workers' rights and the environment, and they ruin the geopolitical positions of these countries. For all those reasons, we're extremely proud to oppose.
Mr. Speaker, members of this House, the nationalisation of resources is the best way for South American countries to develop. We think it's the best way because it's the most effective, because it's fairer, and it has political benefits. That's our extension, and that's what I'm going to talk about under two rubrics. Firstly, economics. Secondly, politics, because that seems to be the only framework opening up understand. So, economics. We think the best part of Venezuela's nationalisation project has been their public spending. Under the Consolidated Social Fund, they have done a number of things. The biggest part is that they have reduced poverty from 54% of the Venezuelan population down to 27% of the Venezuelan population. And what they said is 70% taxation is pretty high, but we say 100% taxation is even better when your number one priority is to stop people starving to death, Mr. Speaker. And when you and Chavez, however much you might not like him, has demonstrated his ability to do that with this money, we think that is the number one priority in this debate. What else has Chavez done under his misiones and using the Consolidated Social Fund? He has subsidised food for poor people, proving that he can actually stop people from starving to death. He has tangibly made welfare a priority. He has made health and education a key part of development, a social priority, something that even the most expansive corporate social responsibility programs are never going to be able to do to the same level as government. He's redistributed wealth, particularly in an excellent way, because of where Chavez has drawn his power from the poor people, from the barrows. No, thank you. And we think that if you look at something like the Barro Adento Health Program, which was Chavez's initiative to fly Cuban doctors, because they are the best in the region, to Venezuela, that has been incredibly costly. That has been the kind of thing that what you need to do is to have a lot of money. Not just money to spend on that, but money to do all your other things with. Because when you're a government, and you need to spend money on development, but poor people don't have the amazing social cachet and the amazing ability to control and influence government, you need to be able to deal with multiple priorities at once. And we think the benefit of nationalisation is it means you get the maximum amount of money out of a resource as you possibly can. We think that in a situation like Latin America, where the priority for development is redistribution, in particular, we think the government needs to have much more control over where these profits lie, rather than, no thank you, corporations being the ones to get the majority of the profits. Rather than corporations being able to staff higher level positions in oil refining with their own people, we think a mixture of staffing with locals is incredibly important for development because they get things like skills, Mr. Speaker, which are then useful later on, because they are able to trickle down their knowledge and use that later. We think on the level of human rights and with regards to public spending, the more money you can get, the better, especially because when you need to spend money on poor people, you also have to have money left over to do the other stuff. So that's why it's not just enough to have some money, we need more money. And when the question in this debate is people starving to death, we are more than happy to put more money into the Consolidated Social Fund. That's why we think that public spending outcomes are beneficial. My second level under this theme is development. And why do we think that this is a particularly potent development tool? Because we think that when you develop, when you want, especially as a poor country to develop, being as they are mostly the ones that want to develop, we're already there, we think that what you want is foreign direct investment because you want companies to come in to use your resources to get the benefit out of them so that you get money and can then sell things in the open market. We think the number one thing that a company needs for as an incentive to invest in your country is security. But particularly in the current climate, they need energy security. When we're looking at ways that poor countries can develop, manufacturing is a key element. But you don't set up a manufacturing plant if you're not confident you're going to get energy. You especially don't set up a manufacturing plant if you don't feel like you're going to be able to make money out of it because you're paying so much for oil and gas, Mr. Speaker. We think that under a policy of nationalisation, and this is the key difference between the do we get money from oil or money from tax, you control where the oil goes. You literally control where the power and energy goes. So that when a company is considering whether to take the risk of establishing a factory, or whether they have one factory and they want to set up a second manufacturing plant to make some more cars, no thank you, which is a well-discovered pathway to development. We think when they're making the decision to make that investment, knowing that the oil will not be sold offshore to richer customers, knowing that that oil will be controlled by the government and directed because you are operating in Venezuela or Bolivia is going to be a key indicator for these companies of whether A, they will invest in Venezuela, no thank you, or these other countries, or B, they will expand their investment in Venezuela, take the extra risk, open another factory. Knowing that you have energy security is a key element of development. We had the example brought to us, and I'll take you in a moment by the other side, of China. They said China developed without doing this, so why can't other countries? We disagree. We think China exactly developed by harnessing its natural resource and getting the maximum benefit out of it. Its natural resource happened to be people, Mr. Speaker, and Venezuela doesn't happen to have that same one. But what its natural resource is energy, and we think they should get the 100% benefit that they can out of it so they can be like China and India. Don't you agree?
Why would any foreign company or any foreign government invest in Venezuela if they think their property is going to be forcibly repatriated?
Yeah, because they're doing it right now, which counterproves what you're saying. But secondly, because there's a big principal difference, and this leads to my second point. There's a big principal difference between nationalising an energy sector, which is stuff that's in the ground that if you look at it, actually belongs to you and your people, and what, stealing a car factory so you can sell Ford as Forda. We don't think that stuff like that is going to happen, ladies and gentlemen. We think Venezuela is unlikely to steal Ford away from Ford. That's why Ford will invest. We think they're more likely to invest if they have energy security, and having the ability to control where energy goes is one of the key benefits of nationalisation. To my second theme, politics. In principle, Mr. Speaker, this resource belongs to the government and the people, and there's never been a single response to that. Because sovereignty means control of your country and all the things within it, including the borders, including military, and including the resources that don't exist on the surface. This is a principle of international law and international norms. It even extends into the sea, Mr. Speaker, and we think it's an important one in this debate. Why? Because this is exactly what the West did. No, thank you. We think that in particular, BP, not always did it mean beyond petroleum. It used to mean British Petroleum. We think the West is being incredibly hypocritical emblemicized by the opening opposition in saying you shouldn't do this, when this is exactly what the West did in many instances to generate the money that they needed to develop in the first place. Let's talk about political power, because we've heard a lot about corruption from the other side. But on closing government, what we think is that it's actually better on a political level to nationalise your oil resources. Why? Because we think economic development, especially one that involves multiple segments of the economy, especially the kind that's going on in Venezuela, is better for accountability of government. Because when you enrich the middle class, they have more capacity to agitate. They have more ability to ask for rights and demand more things of government. We think that a policy of nationalisation will enrich the middle class more for two key reasons. Firstly, because you get a greater proportion of the profits, and secondly, because when it's done in a way that redistributes wealth, which is what we're seeing right now, that's what's going to happen. Lastly, let's talk about the environment and tertiary concerns. We think that things like the environment and labour rights are things that the government can make into policy when they control both the policy side of things and the practical implementation of it. We think if people care about the environment so much, the government is in the most flexible position to impact things like oil extraction for it. Mr. Speaker, what has closing government told you? This is a preferable path to development because it's effective, because of investment, because it's fairer, and because it's politically beneficial. And that's why we propose.
basic assumption that they're bringing to the table here is that these countries can't trade with the major companies like everyone else. That these countries in South America are being taken advantage of. That they are unable to trade like the rest of the world was, and thus they need a government to save them from themselves. But I have a little bit more faith in the people of South America to trade, and I have a lot of faith in the third world in general, that when they liberalize their markets and stop relying on their governments to save them, that's when you get success stories like China. And so, which is a success story you need to learn a lot more about, but I'll get to that when I get to refutation. So, the principle that they bring is similar. They say that it's theirs, and that that these countries should be able to have exclusive control over them. But this isn't about principle. This is about making a policy that works. And at the point where following your principle is something that's going to lead the country into economic ruin that we've done, we believe that principles are only as good as they bring about useful policy. And we're going to show how this doesn't bring about useful policy. Moreover, they say that it's a hypocritical thing for the U.S. for the West in general to deny them their right to nationalize their resources when the West did it. But Western capitalism was based on the backs of slaves, ladies and gentlemen. But we have no obligation to let them to make our same mistake just because we made it once before. So we believe that this too is a principle that we should disregard. Continue.
CNOOC, which is a Chinese natural gas and oil company, is one of the biggest in the world. It's completely state-owned, and recently it invested money in the US. How can you then say that nationalization is not successful?
This is why. First of all, let's go to this contention that nationalized systems are very good and reinvest. Well, we believe that China's company is so successful is because China has a whole lot of oil. It doesn't have anything to do with how well the government's running it. In fact, we see that companies that, this is what they were telling you about, that companies that are nationalized don't do the long-term reinvestment. Because at best, if you're in a democracy where you're beholden to the will of the people, then you're trying to give them the short-term benefits that will show up in the next 4 years so you can get elected. And if at worst you're in a populist dictatorship, then you're going to be distributing your resources ineffectively in order to shore up your popularity. So we've seen this in two circumstances. For instance, Iran has vastly underestimated the ability of its current resources to produce, but the government has not been willing to reinvest and drill new holes because they're trying to shore up the will of their populace. Moreover, the Saudi government is also looking for short-term profit, and they've repeatedly denied the opportunity to create a reserve for their resources, to turn them into petrochemicals, and instead have opted for the short-term profit of selling. We've seen companies, on the other hand, like Shell, reinvesting in not only new technologies, such as green tech, in the way that nationalized systems have not, but we've also seen them reinvesting in new drilling platforms, which is necessary. So then they also say that foreign direct investment will flow. But this is wrong because not if the IMF blacklists you, which is something that he alluded to, not if the U.S. will prosecute you for supporting a regime that they don't consider good by investing. So we believe that this FDI thing isn't really brought forward. And then there's the whole point about that these leaders are rapacious and are corrupt and are toting up to the companies. But if these leaders are so rapacious, as I pointed out, then why do you want to give them whole control? I mean, I've had arguments that I've prepared, stolen from me by my own side once before, but I've never had them stolen by the opposite side. And we believe that at the point where you're agreeing with this, and then you said, oh, no, it's not a problem, there are no more dictators anymore. Hugo Chavez, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't want a dictator, let's get something like a constitution. Let's get something like freedom of the press. Continue.
Hugo Chavez has a constitution. He tried to amend it, and the people said no. We think that that's fundamentally democracy in action.
Whoa. He tried to amend it, and the people said no. Yes, the people who he wasn't depriving of resources because he has nationalized control of them. Yes, the people, some of the people. But here's the thing is that you can't just have a government that serves the will of some of the people the way that Hugo Chavez is. Moreover, the reason that he did it was because he was afraid of people within his own party, not the opposition within the country. So we believe that, yes, Venezuela is definitely not a democracy. So let's bring me to my new substantial point, is that they talked about how this relates to economics, and how this relates to politics within, sort of within the country and the issue of corruption. We want to look at a larger world because we believe that the world we live in is a global economic world. And this is why my two contentions are going to be that first allows nations to use their nationalized resources as a weapon, and two, that they can use the resources against their own people to have the kind of corrupt oppression that we see in Hugo Chavez. So first of all, it allows nations to use their nationalized resources as a weapon. And we've seen this, Chavez do this, in fact, by depriving oil going to Colombia. And in a system where companies are just following blind greed and shipping it to whoever's going to buy it, you don't see people turning off the gas. This is why we've seen the nationalized systems of Russia, for instance, turning off the nozzle to Ukraine and freezing that in the winter when they get a little too uppity. This is why you've seen Russia using its oil resources to pressure the EU. And we believe that when you give governments the ability and total control over their resources to decide where they go, who they're trading with, and where they're investing, then you're going to give them the ability to use this as a weapon in the global context. And what this does is it creates global economic war in which the citizens of the country are the ones that freeze in the winter, the citizens of the country that are hurt. And we've already seen Chavez doing this, and we don't want to enable anyone else to do this. So then, this is the point that I want to clash with the extension they brought up, and they said it's fairer, and that it produces more, political fairness for the country. But we believe that this is wrong, because a government that has total control over the resources, over the companies, they are able to deploy these against their own people, specifically the people in their country that they don't like. Because when company decides, then they send it to wherever it's going to have a profit. But Hugo Chavez doesn't care. So what he's done is he's established refineries in the places that support him. He's shut down refineries in the places like the area around Caracas that don't support him as much. And so what we've done is that it's impossible to have a real democracy when a government can deprive you of a job. Moreover, giving the government the ability to do this is tantamount, is allowing them to violate human rights, because, thank you for the debate last night, it's an international human right to have a government that does not deny you the right to get a job. And when you nationalize a government that is as corrupt as they've already told you for longer than I will, then you allow them to deploy these resources against their own people, and this contradicts democracy, this contradicts human rights. So, in the globalized system where we want, unless we want a system of neo-mercantilism, where you're using your resources to deprive another country of theirs, and unless we want a system that is as politically corrupt as the Bolivarian Revolution, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to call upon the government whip to close the case for their side.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we've brought you from Closing Government in this debate is the analysis that this is the right action for these countries now. And the examples we've got down the bench from the opposition, when they've tried to point to China, when they've tried to point to India, are exactly the sorts of things that we're talking about. Because this is not repeating the mistakes of slavery of the West. This is looking at what parts of development worked in Western countries, what methods helped channel the benefits coming from national resources into empowering the population to bring us to the point of development today. So no, this isn't repeating the mistakes of the past. This would be denying the ability to emulate the successes if we followed what the opposition wanted to do. I've got 3 points that I want to look at in this debate. Firstly, I want to look at the question of economic development and which pathway gives us the biggest benefits of economic development in Latin American countries. Secondly, I want to look at the political ramifications, both domestically and regionally. And finally, I want to finish with a quick analysis of the way in which people's rights are protected and regulations under both of these systems. Let's start with economic development. Because what we heard, ladies and gentlemen, from the opposition was that it's okay, we get a fair bit anyway. Well, that's just not good enough, ladies and gentlemen, particularly when you consider the size of the profits that are keeping and attracting these foreign companies to work in these countries in the first place. The reason that they invest in South American countries is because the profits they're pulling out number in the tens and hundreds of billions. So this is a huge amount of money that South American nations like Bolivia and Argentina need to be able to exploit in order that they too can emulate the incredibly beneficial strategies that Hugo Chavez has been implementing in Venezuela. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that it's not a case of no investment from these governments. Firstly, because we think governments have a much better long-term imperative than companies ever will. We got this twisted characterization from our opening opposition, who tried to tell you that companies are less driven by short-term profit than the governments. Well, one thing multinational companies have to do is turn over enormous profits, because they are susceptible to the only metric is profit. And that's what they stand by. But secondly, they don't have to stick around and stay in that country, because they can strip everything out of a country and then move on somewhere else. A government can't. Quite frankly, we don't think Hugo Chavez is looking in the short term anyway. I mean, what he was trying to change the constitution to do was to allow him to stay even longer. The point here, guys, is that wasn't allowed, but he's in it for the long term, and he's not here for stupid short-term strategies. But nor are any governments, ladies and gentlemen, because if governments strip and burn and destroy and suppress the rights of their own population in that way, then they don't need to benefit, and they don't get elected again, not just now, but in the next election, ladies and gentlemen. That's how political pressure works. And the fact that they gave you the statistic, well, there hasn't been much exploration going on in Venezuela, might point to the fact that they've already discovered the Orinoco Belt, ladies and gentlemen, which is considered to be the world's largest existing oil reserve. The facts that they have given you are misleading in this debate, because they've only given you half of the picture. What we told you further, ladies and gentlemen, is that it's not, well, what I'm telling you further now, it's not a matter of them losing goodwill in the financial crisis that will destroy their ability to succeed. We think right now in the financial crisis, it's really important for them to have more profit and more revenue directly, particularly for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because we think they're paying just enough that it's not theft, but not so much that they can't afford it, right? That was the subtlety of what the opening government proposed. The second point here, ladies and gentlemen, is that the West can complain a little bit, but not too much. Why is this better? Because they get the profits directly, they get more money to shore up, in some ways, their struggling economies. But ladies and gentlemen, we also see incredible benefits because they can invest and help, and they're not beholden to the risk of these companies collapsing. What we further gave you in our extension, ladies and gentlemen, is quite frankly that this measure works to stimulate economic development in these countries. That despite the fact that Chavez has done this, foreign direct investment still exists in that country. And we think incredibly beneficially in this climate, the ability to guarantee energy security is crucial to the ability of companies to decide to set up shop and invest in manufacturing industries in those countries. That's why we think this is better for the economic development of the country. But we think it's better too, ladies and gentlemen, because it helps the people in ways that are positive for them and benefit them politically. So,
okay, this isn't just a question of goodwill from the rest of the world, it's a question of the IMF. If these countries nationalize, are going to do everything in their power to prove these systems don't work by shutting them down.
Thank you, sir. It hasn't happened. The IMF hasn't blacklisted Venezuela and has still made money and resources available, as has America. We don't think this is a reality that you're talking about. But more than that, we think they get more out of their own investment than they ever would out of the IMF, that seems to have struggled to ever generate any success anywhere in the world. The second point, political implications. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we think firstly, and what we gave you in our model that wasn't responded to, is what we do is empower the political classes in these countries. That's what Venezuela has been able to do with the money they have. Because when you have education, ladies and gentlemen, and when you have health, you have the ability to say no to someone, as they did to Chavez's reforms, because they proved that they were no longer so beholden on the need for handouts, because he had lifted them out of a poverty where they could actually begin to think about what was better politically rather than just their hip pocket. That's how we empower the political classes. Then their extension, ladies and gentlemen, was that this would empower the world, these countries against the world. Our first response, ladies and gentlemen, is that's not necessarily a bad thing. South American countries have been screwed over by American intervention for decades. The United States and the West has a horrible record of attempting to topple governments in these regions, of pushing horrible deals on these countries. And if this, ladies and gentlemen, gives power to broker deals and political influence for these countries against the West, then we think that's good and it's in their interest to do so. More than that, ladies and gentlemen, as long as other nations can do this, we think it actually helps them to play on an even field. Because under the status quo, Venezuela can buy influence in their region because they have these oil revenues, but Argentina and Bolivia can't. When they start to nationalize and have the same richness of oil revenues, they too can deal with resisting the influences of Venezuela. The final point, ladies and gentlemen, is about protecting people's rights and regulations. We heard these leaders are corrupt, ladies and gentlemen. It's just not true. These are incredibly democratic governments where they have lost elections and votes on the way they want to do, ladies and gentlemen. And in terms of who would provide better exploitation and regulation, well, it might be helpful for a second to look at one of the examples from the closing opposition, when they told us that Chavez shut down refineries in Caracas. That's because the pollution from these refineries was killing people, because they were placed in the centre of cities, ladies and gentlemen. Regulation and rights are always better off under a government. Well, let's talk about that a little bit more. What they told us is that unlike governments which are subject to pressure domestically, companies are subject to pressure back home. Yeah, but that doesn't do anything, ladies and gentlemen. When Chavez crushes people's rights, he has to answer for that at the next election. Ladies and gentlemen, in this debate, what we showed you is that the most effective path to development for the countries of Latin America is to nationalize their oil resources for prosperity and for the future. Thank you.
Finally, I'd like to welcome the opposition whip.
Good afternoon. I always love giving the last speech because it gives me the only real legitimate opportunity to say congratulations to everybody. So, having just seen the debate that I just saw before me, I think you will all agree that there are three main regions, three main fields, three main issues that have come up in this debate. And many of them have been mentioned, but not all of them have been mentioned by the other whip speaker. So what are those three issues, which when explored will clearly show that South American countries should not nationalize their energy resources? Well, these three things are the international ramifications, which was brought up by extension and refuted in about 2 sentences, allegedly, by the whip speaker. And then we also have the economics of the issues. And then we also have the political ramifications that will come about if these South American countries do nationalize their resources. Getting right into it as quickly as possible. Internationally, nationalizing energy resources has huge ramifications because what it does is it empowers countries to use energy as a tool. And we think that is something that is dangerous and harmful, both on a pragmatic level, but also extremely dangerous and extremely immoral because energy is not like other resources. It is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And we believe that necessities should not be used, no please, we should not be used as a tool. How does this work? Well, in a multipolar system where everybody wants a leg up, in a globalized world where everybody wants a comparative advantage, nationalization provides just another weapon for countries to use this in their power pursuit. And we gave you multiple examples, none of which were engaged. That's what Russia is doing when it turns off the gas and oil nozzle to Ukraine because it didn't like their new policies. That's what Russia is doing when it tells Georgia, we don't like what you're doing in our provinces, so we're going to cut off oil and cut off gas for the winter. We don't think that that's something that Russia has a right to do, and we don't think that that's something that benefits anybody when Russia does it. But if that's not appropriate enough for you, let's take it back to South America. That's what Venezuela is doing when it cuts off oil to Colombia because they have political problems. That's what Colombia is doing, and we think this is fundamentally wrong.
Point, sir.
Sure, try it.
So, the Barrio Adentro Health Program costs a lot of money, but it saved tens of thousands of lives in Venezuela. Wouldn't it be a good thing if Colombia and Argentina could implement a similar policy?
No, sir, because you're suggesting that the only way for a country to get money is to nationalize its energy resources. I believe this is not only wrong, but I think it's misleading, and I think it's unfair to these countries to suggest that unless they take control of the one natural resource they have, that they're incapable of making money. We say there are other ways to make money. We say there are long-term investments. We say there's international recapitalization and reinvestment that are far preferable because we can get that money without incurring the various harms that we are issuing you today. But getting back to what I was saying. So not only is it dangerous to allow countries to use energy as a weapon in the international world, but it's also immoral. You want to talk about principles, but how principled is it, my friends, to allow a country to use a necessity for living, like heating oil, against another country? How principled is it to allow Hugo Chavez to buy support for his government by supplying them with something that should be a human right, which is the ability to stay warm? We don't think that this is appropriate. We think it is immoral. We think it is wrong. Clearly. Oh, and yet we see their refutation was, well, maybe it would be good for South American countries to have another weapon because they need to be empowered. And they say it's good if they can use this weapon against the West. But may I remind you, Venezuela would never dare stop trading its oil with the West, but it clearly has no problem stopping trading with Colombia. So clearly, we say that when we allow these countries to use weapons as infighting within their own region, weakening their regional ability, weakening their regional power, that this is actually the last thing that's going to get them to an equal playing field with the Western world. So clearly, your one refutation ignores the very example we gave you of Colombia using it against other South American countries. It does not stand, our argument carries forth. On the international level, it is dangerous and immoral to do these things. But then we've also seen a couple of other issues brought out forth in this debate. One of them was economics. And one of the points that we made is that you can make energy money without nationalization. You can renegotiate the contracts. And they like to paint a picture. They like to portray a scene where, well, if companies are extracting the oil, then none of the money is going to the country. And we say this is fundamentally misleading. They accuse us of misleading, and yet they paint a completely biased picture. Well, we say, actually, in these circumstances, money is going to both of these places, and that's better. And then we say if we can actually go about getting money to both the companies and the countries without limiting foreign recapitalization, without limiting foreign investment, that's a good thing that we should, we ought, and we must to do by opposing this motion. Furthermore, we say that one of the good things about having these split revenues between the companies and the countries is that the countries actually tax the oil, so they get the profits without having to incur the cost of extracting the oil. And then we say in the long run, if you can incur profits without incurring costs, this is a good thing for these countries.
Fine, sir.
No. So, economically, they seem to paint a very biased picture in which it's all one side or all of the other. We say no, we can have a little bit of both ways. It's not exactly eating your cake and having it too, but it's called a compromise, and that is the basis of all debate, and we regret that you couldn't engage us on these issues. But what else have we seen? Politically, we have seen that having, which is actually brought up in the lower half and also re-embellished in my partner's extension, is that this leads to dubiously elected leaders having even more power and having even more control over their corporations. And we say this is a bad thing. First, government gets up here and says that now there's checks and balances on Chavez in Venezuela. Well, my friends, if we understand checks and balances to be a free press, if we understand checks and balances to be an independent judiciary, then I am afraid to tell you, you are erroneous and incorrect in your evaluation of the democracy of Venezuela. We say that when you have leaders who have come to power in this way, it is not good to equip them with another way to suppress their people. It is not good to re-empower them even further, because that is not only not good policy, as we have shown you, but it is unprincipled, which is what you have shown us. So, what have I told you here today? There are 3 issues on which we must clearly see we cannot and should not and must not let South American countries nationalize their resources. On an international level, it provides countries a weapon in the form of a necessity to use in a multipolar globalized economy, use against other countries and to use against their own people. It allows both nationalizing the resources actually robs countries of investments, of foreign capitalization, and it also robs the people of a chance to rise up or to speak against their leaders. Because I promise you, a Venezuelan will be a lot less apt to oppose Hugo Chavez if there is the chance, the likelihood, the probability that he will withhold oil in return. So because it's bad internationally, because it's harmful economically, and because it's unprincipled politically, we beg you to oppose. Thank you.
Thanks to all the speakers. We're going to go to the tab room, so you guys can stay here or go wherever you like.
It's always a pleasure, man. You guys are terrific. What up? Cheers, man. Take care.
Lucas.